I want to do this for Refer Shleima for Yerachmiel ben Eta, Selma bat Rachel, Shifra Simcha bat Yet, and all Cholim of Klal Yisrael.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so the next melacha is opening packets. Well, it's a sub melacha under the tearing. So food containers, such as boxes, cans, and sealed bags, should be opened before Shabbos. Reason for this is not only to avoid tearing, but also because such an activity normally constitutes the formation of a new receptacle into which items can be removed and inserted, such as, well, the Hebrew word for that is called a kli, a vessel. Okay. If a food packet is still sealed on Shabbos, it may be opened, provided that it is open to a degree which renders it useless. That it is open to a degree which renders it useless, the tearing is then considered a destructive act, and the packet cannot be construed as a usable container or kli. A cereal box may be opened by tearing it along 3 sides. A can of food may be opened by piercing a small hole in the base, turning it over, and then opening the top with an opener in the normal way. Milk or fruit juice cartons may be opened in the same manner by first piercing a hole in the base. Certain authorities permit the opening of containers in the normal way if they are emptied immediately and of a type which may not be used again. For example, soda cans, small milk, or fruit cartons. One may use a bottle opener or corkscrew since the top which is removed is separate from the bottle and no new container has been formed. A paper label which covers the cap or cork may be removed. Care should be taken not to tear through the lettering. Paper layers glued together may not be steamed apart. One may not untie packets tied with a string, but the string may be cut. Wire or plastic ties may not be twisted or untwisted. Okay, that's that basically. The last point is one may not untie packets tied with a string. So you must just cut it or tear it, but the string may be cut. Wire or plastic ties may not be twisted or untwisted. Okay, I don't think we have many. That doesn't happen to us very often.
Now, you sometimes get bread that's got like a cable tie on it, sort of thing, and you have to, I'm just saying, for some people.
Most of the bread we buy, Gavin, has got that plastic doodah that you push
I don't
through.
buy that bread, right? So then it's got the plastic thing. That's right. That's even newer. So you don't have a problem, right?
So you know what? Next time I buy bread, you must remind me to give you one of those things for Shabbos, which is kind of handy.
Ziploc.
No, it's not a Ziploc. It's a plastic doodah, whatever the hell it is.
So I buy a lot of rye, and I also buy from Schottenstein, and neither of them give that thing, and it's a very clever thing to have.
Okay, let's start the Gemara here. Okay, all right. What time is Mincha, Kev? What time?
An hour from now. We've got an hour.
Yeah, an hour from now is fine. We'll be fine.
All right. So I'm just going to share my screen a second.
Just share. I'm just eating at the same time. I'll be a second. Just share it.
Okay, Gav, are you back?
Be back in a second. Okay, I'm back.
All right. Gavin, you want to read the screen, Gav?
Sure. Okay, the Mishnah discusses the law regarding an ox that killed unintentionally. Just move this out the way. If an ox was rubbing itself against the wall and the wall collapsed on a man and killed him, or the ox intended to kill an animal but instead killed a man, or to kill a Canaanite but instead killed a Jew, or to kill non-viable babies but instead killed a viable one, all of these cases, the ox is exempt.
Okay, very straightforward. All right, so we're going to hit straight into the Gemara now. We're on page 44A2. So now the Mishnah rules that the ox is exempt for an unintentional killing. So the Gemara discusses what's the exact meaning of this term. Shmuel said the ox is exempt from death, but its owner is liable to pay kofeh. What do we mean the ox is exempt from death? From stoning. But it still means that the owner is liable to pay kofir. But Rav said it's exempt from both this and that. What do we mean this and that? Death and kofir. Because Rav doesn't hold like Shmuel. Shmuel says that there's still kofir payment even if the animal isn't put to death. But Rav said that the kofir payment is directly related to the death of an animal because he's holding that there's the same link between human beings. That just like there's no kapora if you don't put a person to death for murder, so too in this case, it's the same thing. But here, we're talking about an unintentional killing. So the Gemara answers, this case of our Mishnah is as Rav said. Okay? So before we do this, the Gemara challenges Shmuel. It said, but why should there be liability to kofir in the Mishnah's first case? Why? Because the ox is tam. So the Gemara answers, this case of our Mishnah is as Rav said in explanation of a different Mishnah. Okay? It refers to where the oxes are muad to fall onto people in pits. Okay. Here then too, our Mishnah refers to a case in which the oxes are muad to rub against people and topple walls onto people. So guys, if you don't know what's going on, I'm going to share the screen because I have a feeling you didn't absorb the Mishnah. Am I right?
We'll see now.
Yeah, well, it's all very well when it's in front of you. Okay. So as Gav, just read the beginning part about the wall.
Okay, I was eating something. The Mishnah discusses the laws regarding an ox that killed unintentionally. If an ox rubbing itself against the wall and the wall collapsed on a man and killed him, that one.
Yeah. So what we're saying is that clearly there we're not. How is it that you would have to pay kofir? Okay, because it seems as though it's accidental. An unintentional killing is that the ox was trying to get physical gratification, and in response to rubbing itself against the wall, it killed a man. So that's an unintentional killing. So why would you have to pay kofir according to that? Because Shmuel is saying the ox is exempt from the death penalty, which makes sense, and is liable for kofir. So it's a bit difficult to understand. But Rav said it's exempt from the death penalty and kofir. That is easier to understand. So the Gemara is obviously challenging Shmuel and saying, well, why would there be liability for kofir in the Mishnah's first case? Because the ox is tam. Now, why wouldn't you think the ox is tam? Because how many times do you think an animal would be resting against the wall and it falling and squishing somebody? It's not such an obvious case. Firstly, it's very difficult to imagine that the ox would get away with it for one particular reason, is that if it did kill a person, we would say even for the ox, you'd put it to death in the case of goring. But this is a case of shame. So we learned a case where it's not always the same. Do you know what I mean? As regards to shame and regel. That's number one. There was a discussion with Rava and Abaya, if you remember correctly.
Yeah.
And then you've also got a case of if the animal's tam, because how would the animal generally do this as a serial wall breaker? So that's why the Gemara is saying why the ox is tam. It's making its statement. And the Gemara says, no, this case of a Mishnah is, as Rav said, in explanation of a different Mishnah, and it refers to where the ox is more to fall onto people in pits. Here too, then our Mishnah refers to a case in which the ox is a muad to rub against the wall and it topples onto people. So let's just discuss where we're finding this from. Is that there is a Gemara on 48b. It's an unusual scenario. Okay. And if you're looking at that particular Gemara, it's talking about a case starting in 47b where an ox falls into a pit, killing a person who was at the bottom of a pit. And then the owner is liable for kofir. The Gemara in 48b asks why this is so, since presumably the ox was tam with regard to killing people in this manner. So therefore, obviously, if the ox is tam and it's indirect, you wouldn't put the ox to death. Therefore, Rav maintains that the Mishnah refers to a case where the ox already killed people in this fashion 3 times previously, and thus became a muad with regard to falling into people into pits. Well, guys, it seems like pretty unusual, to be honest, because who's generally a pit in the Gemara is discussed as somebody creating it for no rhyme or reason. So we've got to assume, A, this is a municipal pit, which means people were trying to do sewerage. I mean, they weren't exactly in those days laying electricity poles down. So I don't know what they'd be in the pit for. People used to throw the sewerage in septic tanks and empty it out. So I don't know why they would need a pit, because it's not exactly that indoor plumbing was the fashion of the season. It's difficult to explain why, to be honest. But apparently this ox is muad, so let's just move on. The Gemara objects to this interpretation. If it's so that the ox habitually topples walls onto people, then it's subject to death for this act, since it's clearly intended to kill. It is understandable then, the case which Rav refers, that the ox was not executed, for in that case refers to where the ox saw some vegetation growing from the wall of the pit and accidentally fell into the pit while trying to reach it. Hence, the ox didn't intend to kill. But here in the Gemara, and the Mishnah's case, it talks about habitually toppling walls into people, and it can be said, why is the ox not executed? So here, guys, it's clearly talking about what? A case where it would seem to be intentional that it topples walls onto people. So the Gemara says no. This case in our Mishnah is similar. It's where the ox rubbed against a wall for its own gratification. In other words, to scratch its hide, or the process of relieving some sort of an itch, okay? And in the process, the wall is toppled and therefore is not liable to death. Why is the ox not liable to death, guys?
This was unintentional. This is something it does.
Exactly. So listen, I can actually see the case of the wall toppling more common than a ox falling into a pit for two reasons. Is why are people in the pit? There's no plumbing and electricity infrastructure in those days. That's number one. Because we learned that people used to keep their sewage in septic tanks and let it out in the rainy season. So that's clearly a proof. The fact of it is, even South Africa today doesn't have much electricity, but then no one did. So that's the second thing. And then the thing of it is, where it was talking about in that case, where it went for vegetation and it stretched out and kept falling in the pit, you'd have to have a person there and an ox stretching for vegetation in the same time. It's saying here it's more likely that it rubbed up against the wall for gratification.
Yeah.
So the Gemara asks an obvious question, which Gavin often asks, and Kevin asks, not that you don't, but how do we know that in fact the ox intended merely to scratch its heart? Kevin asked that question last. You remember, Kevin, something similar?
I was going to ask
Perhaps its intent was to kill the person. So Kevin would say to me normally, which is a good question, well, how do you know? How can you reach into the ox's brain and work out what it intended to do? Perhaps it was intentional to kill the person. So the Gemara answers, because after the wall collapsed, the person was already dead. The ox continued to rub itself against it. So clearly the ox is a little stupid and was continually rubbing, which means it wasn't even aware that there was a person dead below, which means that the goal couldn't have been achieved to squish the person. So the Gemara asks, we're on the 44th daf. We've now, guys, hit the 44th daf. Congratulations. Yeah.
This is an off-the-wall example.
Very funny. It is an off-the-wall example. It's true. It's true. Yeah. But still, this case is an example of tsoros, for which there's no liability for kofir. Yeah. How can then Shmuel interpret the Mishnah to obligate kofir? So I just want to explain this to you guys, is that tsoros means that it's any damage caused by a force generated by an animal rather than through direct contact between the animal's body and the damaged article. Because we learned a case in 2b where damage was caused by pebbles that shot out from under the feet of a horse, for example, as it walked through. Sorry, it was in 3b. So in the case of a Mishnah, the victim wasn't killed through direct contact with the ox's body, rather by the wall that the ox pushed over in the fact that it wanted to scratch. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the standard killing is when an ox gores a man or a woman. That's direct contact with the horn in the body of the person. but it wasn't a force generated by the animal. So only we realized that even according to, do you remember there was Rava and Abai, and Rava said it has to be carrying damage with a horn. Because remember with the case where the horn, what difference is it if it used its member to kill a woman where she obviously was sodomized or bled to death, or where it used its horn to gore? So the one was for physical gratification, at which there was a case with a buyer, which said even if it was Regal or Shane or Karen, in that case, it's direct bodily content, you still pay coffee. Whereas Rava said it has to be Karen. Okay, but even according to a buyer, there's no direct bodily contact here, so you wouldn't pay coffee. So we say, how does Shmuel interpret that there's a coffee payment? The Gemara answers, Rav Mari, the son of Rav Kahana, said, the Mishnah refers to a case where the fallen wall moved constantly through the direct pressure of the ox until it fell on the person. Okay, so then in that particular case, it's not that the ox scratched and then the wall fell over onto the victim. It was the ox's pressure against the wall, even as it toppled, pushing it until it fell on its victim. So that's not considered a force generated by the ox that caused the death, but the ox itself, the pressure of the ox's body and the wall interposing between them. That's according to the Nimukei Yosef. So it wasn't done with intent to kill, but rather for the animal's pleasure. That's why the animal isn't put to death, because it's unintentional, but there's still a coffee payment there. Does that make sense? That's according to Shmuel. According to Rav, is that the wall was merely just toppled by the animal scratching, and there wasn't direct bodily pressure from the animal at it. So therefore, he said there's no coffee and there's no death, because it's unintentional, no coffee because there's no direct bodily contact. Shmuel is saying there is direct bodily content, but no intent. So therefore, there's no death of the animal, but still coffee. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that's fine. So it says the dispute between Rav and Shmuel is decided. A brisa was taught in accordance with Shmuel and in refutation of Rav. Okay. So I don't know if when I don't think this is talking about the previous case, because it's got a colon talking about the case to follow. So I don't know if this would be the previous one would be going according to Shmuel or not. I have no idea. But if there's a colon, I'm assuming it's pushing to where it's talking about this next case. Okay. So a brisa was taught in accordance with Shmuel and in refutation of Rav, meaning it's agreeing with Shmuel. There is a case in which the ox that killed a person is liable to death and its owner is liable to kofar. And there is a case in which the owner is liable to kofar, but the ox is exempt from death. And there is a case in which the ox is liable to death, but the owner is exempt from kofar. Okay? And there is a case in which the ox and the owner are exempt from death and exempt from kofar. Okay. So as far as I'm going to share this verse with you. Okay, just give me a second, just to see what you guys think. But as far as I know, I'm pretty sure. I'm going to just share my screen with you. Okay, just give me a second, guys. Okay, Arthur, you want to read it?
Yeah, sure. Let me just take it to my big screen. Give me a second. I can read because I got my glasses on now. The dispute between Rav and Shmuel is decided. The Baraisa was taught in accordance with Shmuel and in refutation of Rav. There is a case in which the ox that killed a person is liable to death and its owner is liable to kofar. And there is a case in which the owner is liable to kofar, but the ox is exempt from death. And there's a case in which the ox is liable to death, but the owner is exempt from kofar. And there's a case in which the ox and the owner are exempt from this and from that, death, and kofir.
Fine. So the fact that it has the colon here, I don't think it was saying that the previous brisa was in accordance with Shmuel and a refutation of Rav. The fact that it's got a colon here is I'm assuming that it's talking about the case to follow. I couldn't actually deduce, to be honest, guys. But I would think. What do you guys think? Because when it shared the page, it wasn't part of that page. Technically, there was a gap in the page, in the Gemara's page. Does that make sense, guys?
Sure. Then it must be a new one.
Yeah, because it wasn't part of the previous line, so I think it must be a new one. Okay. Now I'm going to elaborate on it. Do you want me, guys, to test you? Or do you want me just to give you the answer? Because we've done this. You should be able to work it all out.
I'm happy to test Arthur and Kevin. Otherwise, we can just move on.
I'm happy if you test Gavin.
No, I came up with this crap. Stop that.
Okay. All right.
No, Damon, test yourself and give us the answer.
Yeah. Listen, you give us 3 options, and then we'll tell you which one's right.
Give us 4 options.
Okay.
Make it
Go ask the
multiple
rabbi.
choice.
Give us 6 options and pick the rabbi.
Yeah, that's what people do when they ask halachic questions. They say, listen, this is the answer I want. Which rabbi is going to give it to me?
I do that all the time.
So the Brisa elaborates, how is this? So it says, okay, so the first case that we had is a case in which the ox that killed a person is liable to death and the owner is liable to kofir. When do you think that is, guys?
Just
When
say
it
it again.
killed-
Just say it slowly.
Okay, there's a case where the ox is liable to the death penalty and the owner is liable to kofir. What case is that?
What?
Correct. Muad is one factor. Excellent, Kevin. Excellent. What's the other factor?
Intentional from the animal?
Yes. Yes. So Kevin and Gavin, well done. Well done.
Thank you. Kevin, we
Okay.
should do this
I was
more
trying to
often.
get a word in. You guys didn't give me a chance. It's not fair.
You're right. Okay. Silence
wasn't-
is definitely
I-
on your side.
Damn it, I was doing this. I wasn't yawning. I was trying to get a word in. You guys talk too much.
Okay. So exactly as Kevin and Gavin said and Arthur agrees with. Okay, let's give
Good
okay.
one.
Is that it's a muad ox that kills intentionally. Because remember, if it's time, we give the animal the death penalty if it killed a human being, but we don't make the owner liable for kofir. Okay. And if it was unintentional, there's obviously the animal is not liable to death. So this is the case. Okay. Now let's do the second one. Okay. The next one. We're doing a case. In fact, I think I should share my screen for this. Okay. Because this will help give you a clue. And I'm actually going to zoom out a bit so it's not so big. Is that better?
All right. Now
Yeah.
I'll move it to my other screen because I can't see it. All right.
Okay, I'll zoom in. Is that it?
Yeah,
No, that's
better.
I can see.
All right. First one, a brisa was taught in accordance with Shmuel and a refutation of Rav. There is a case in which the ox that killed a person is liable to death and its owner is liable for kofir. So that's exactly it. It's a muad ox that had the intention to kill. Excellent. And there's a case in which the owner is liable to kofir, but the ox is exempt from death. Guys, try and guess it. We've done it.
So the ox,
Ox is come.
yeah, no, it can't be done. Unintentional.
Okay. There's a
Because
case.
if you're liable to kofir, then the animal, it can be time because there are opinions where they say if an animal's time like
No,
Arthur said,
guys, I'll give you a clue. This is what's going to help you. Gavin's right. There are opinions that say that, but immediately we're saying that this is in accordance with Shmuel and in a refutation of Rav. So we know Shmuel's policy now. We knew it from before. Okay, so this is not going according to Rabbi Rav Eli and a million opinions. Are you with me? This is going according to Shmuel. So whenever you read, hang on a second, the second case is as follows. There's a case where there's the owner is liable to kofir, but the ox is exempt from death. If it's liable for kofir, do the first part of the statement.
Oh yes, yes. I know this because so to be able to pay kofir, the animal can't be stoned. Because the animal stoned, you can't pay kofir.
Okay, no. You're mixing a case up.
Okay.
Let's just go one sentence at a time, guys.
Okay.
To find the answer, let's break it up. I could just give it over to you in 2 minutes, but I think it's more fun if you guys.
I'll try and work it out. So if you're liable to kofir, it means
No. Start with the liable for kofir. That's the perfect place to start, Gavin.
All right. So that's where I'm starting because it is the beginning. So it's a good place to start. So liable. See, and I'm cheeky. Yeah? Okay. So if you're liable to kofir, it means that that your animal killed. So somebody died. That's for sure. Okay. So now, if it's not put to death, it must have been unintentional. So it's unintentional. The ox didn't mean to kill. The reason why you're liable for kofir is because that's what Shmuel says, is that you still pay kofir.
Under what case? Tam or muad? You've got to be specific.
No, muad.
Okay, so you got to say that. So that's fine. So it killed a human, a muad ox killed a person. Then you're liable for kofir. That's the full statement, yes.
Okay, and then the reason why the ox is exempt from death is because it killed somebody that it must be unintentional.
Correct. Perfect answer. So it's a muad. The only thing you left out is muad, but I know you know it. So
no, I did add it afterwards. I did add it.
Okay, so it's correct. So you knew the answer. So it's a muad ox that kills unintentionally. It's still it doesn't get put to death, but the owner still pays kofir. Why does he pay kofir?
Somebody still died, eh?
Exactly. It's muad, meaning it was forewarned to be a habitually dangerous animal. Correct. Okay, let's go to the next one. And there is a case in which the ox is live. Now, Gavin, you stay away from it because we're testing the two others now. Okay. I'm sure they can hardly wait. And there is a case in which the ox is liable to death, but the owner is exempt from kofir. When is that?
Can I try, Arthur? Can I try
No,
first,
you
Arthur?
go first. Knock yourself out. Don't feel.
So I think it's the case where a muad ox, let's say what you discussed earlier with the wall, it's muad and it caused the wall to collapse. So it was unintentional, but a death resulted. So that's why maybe there's no kofir.
Okay.
Can I try?
I'm guessing.
Okay, I know the answer. So after Arthur, if he
is it
doesn't get an answer.
When an ox is okay, when an ox is muad, but he kills somebody who's not, what's that thing? I don't know if I'm on the right track here. Somebody who is already going to die. He's already like they're going to die. I'm on the wrong topic.
Okay, listen, I think actually Arthur's got a great point, but it's not something that Shmuel addressed. It's something Rabba addressed, which is, and Rav Eli, I mean, it's a good point, but we want to know opinion of Shmuel. So there's something far more obvious, guys.
I'll tell you.
There's a case where the ox is liable to death. Hang on, Gab, I know you know it.
Oh, I said the ox is killed 3 times in a row.
No. Arthur, you definitely got it wrong. It's tough.
Okay.
The ox is liable. It doesn't. If it kills a person,
yeah,
you definitely put the ox to death, whether it's tam or muad. What would tell you it's tam is the fact that the owner is exempt from kofir. That gives you a clue as to the fact that it's tam. That's the clue. Because the owner only pays for kofir if the ox is muad. If it's liable for death, it means it killed a person. If it's exempt from kofir, it means it's tam. Excellent, Gavin. And there is a case in which the ox and the owner are exempt from death and kofir. What case is that?
I think the case we discussed earlier.
Where,
Okay, can you be more
where nobody's
specific?
killed and the ox is done.
No.
Like the wall. If the ox rubs itself against the wall, so that's
No,
not,
that's the one that's unintentional.
not intending
Okay,
to
so
kill
hang on a second. Hang on a second. Kevin is right. There's an unintentionality to it. I'm happy with that part. And in what case doesn't the animal get put to?
Oh,
So,
okay, hold on.
so
Is it when it's charging something else and it kills something else by accident?
so that's unintentional. Yes, Kevin said that. That's
No,
correct.
but let's say it's charging for a person and it kills somebody else who's, let's say, a Canaanite.
No.
Okay.
The unintentional is.
So I think I've got this one.
Yeah.
I think this one it's got nothing to do with intentional or unintentional. I think it's got to do with exempt from this and that is when I had it. Sorry. If this is not a death case, this is when it's when the animal pierces, like, injures you.
No, that wouldn't be a chiddush. No one gets a death penalty or coffee for injury. That's not a chiddush.
Okay, so there's no chiddush, but at least I was in the right direction, but it's wrong. Okay, I get that. Thank you.
Maybe
I tried.
maybe if the guy the guy in charge of the ox is a person who's has a mental problem and the ox killed.
Okay, listen. It's actually Arthur's technically right, although that's not the answer according to Shmuel.
Okay.
You technically would be correct in that case. In that, but then the animal would still be put to death.
Okay.
What did Arthur say? Sorry, to say it again, Arthur.
If
Mental incompetent. Like
competent
me.
person looks after an animal.
Yeah, so that's where I would have headed next. So if you already headed there, then I would have put something else up.
So there's only one extra aspect, guys, and that is because I'm going to put you out of your misery. So
Please, I'm begging you.
is it's tum. If it's tum, there's no kofir, and there's no death if it's unintentional. So if it's
unintentional tum,
unintentional, according to Shmuel, it's quite straightforward.
Yeah,
okay?
That was for me. Sorry. Okay.
No problem. So you guys did well. It was a good mental exercise.
Okay, so Damon, I just want to go through it again. Okay, so the first case, it was muad, okay, and it was intentional. Okay?
Correct.
Okay, in the second, I'm just writing intentional. In the second case, it was muad, but it was unintentional.
Absolutely, because it's liable to kofir but exempt from death. Exactly.
Okay. In the third case, it was tam, and it was tam, and it was intentional.
Yes, because it's liable to death. That's why the tam is put to death, because it's intentional, but it's only is exempt from kofir.
And the other one, the last one is it's tam and it's unintentional.
Correct. Because there's no death penalty and no kofir. Perfect. Okay. So the Brisa clearly states that there's liability to kofir when a muad kills unintentionally. Okay. When a muad kills unintentionally, the owner must pay kofir, even though the ox is not subject to death. This supports Shmuel's contention and disproves Rav's view, because Rav is of the view that if the animal is not put to death, he holds like Rabba, that if the animal is not put to death, there's no kofir. Shmuel says that there's still kofir because the ox is muad. That's the bottom line. The owner should have looked after it better. And even if it's unintentional where the ox isn't put to death, there's still kofir payment. So the Brisa continues with the dispute regarding liability for an unintentional injury now, inflicted by an ox or a person. And concerning unintentional damages caused by the ox, Rav Yehuda holds the owner liable, and Rav Shimon exempts him. Okay, I'm going to send a new link quickly, guys. Just give me a minute.
Yeah.
Because we're on the clock here. I thought this was worth taking the time to test, to be honest.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You guys all did well, actually. It wasn't so straightforward because we've been quoted a whole lot of opinions. So, all right. So the Brisa continues with a dispute regarding liability for an unintentional injury. We've dealt with death, guys. We haven't dealt with unintentional injuries inflicted by an ox on a person. And concerning unintentional damages caused by the ox, Rabbi Yehuda holds the owner liable and Rabbi Shimon exempts him. So the Gemara is going to explain the reason. Why is Rav Yehuda holds the owner liable? He derives from the owner's liability from the laws governing his kofir liability. Just as in regard to his kofir, he is liable even when his ox killed unintentionally. Okay? This is Rav Yehuda. So too in regard to unintentional damages caused by the ox, he's liable. Okay, so we haven't learned Rav Yehuda yet properly. Well, actually, we did touch on it before, I think in the summary. You remember, guys? Guys, in the summary.
Yeah.
Do you remember what we learned? Is that for unintentional murder, there's kofir, and there's unintentional damages you have to pay, because he derives that from the parallel with kofir. Rabbi Shimon's reasoning is something different. Rabbi Shimon derives the owner's non-liability from the laws governing the ox's execution, because just as in regards to its execution, it's exempt if it kills unintentionally, so too regarding unintentional damage, its owner is exempt. Okay, so again, the parallel. Rav Yehuda is saying there's kofir liability for unintentional murder, and there's damages for unintentional injury. Okay, Rabbi Shimon says, just as the ox is exempt if it kills unintentionally from execution, and then there's no kofir payment, so too with regards to unintentional damage, its owner is exempt. Okay, so the Gemara asks, and Rav Yehuda as well, let him derive from the laws regarding the ox's execution. So the Gemara answers, well, Rav Yehuda maintains that we derive laws regarding payments from laws regarding payments. So what laws regarding payments is it talking about? Well, guys, if it's injury, what do you think it is? It's damages, right?
Yeah.
And from laws regarding payments, kofir. So it's saying, look, Rav Yehuda is actually quite logical, because Rav Yehuda is saying, look, we're discussing payments here, that's all. Kofir is a payment, and in a case where there's no kofir, even if there's unintentional killing, there is kofir. Okay? So if there is kofir, then with regards to damages, if there's not death, you pay damages. What's the difference? You either pay kofir in lieu of the victim's worth, or you pay damages in lieu of the victim's worth. Obviously, damages is not to the whole body, so the payment, even though it's according to the victim's worth, will be prorated to the damage cause. But we do not derive laws regarding payments from laws of execution. Why? He's saying that, well, there isn't really execution of the ox isn't a monetary payment at all, because Rav Yehuda derives liability for unintentional damages from the owner's kofir liability. So it follows that a tam which the owner never pays kofir does not obligate its owner to pay if it unintentionally injures a person. Okay, so do you see the differences, or do you want me to repeat it? Guys, can you give over to me?
You can repeat for me as well. Repeat the other guys, unless somebody got it. Sorry, I lost a bit of track there. Guys, you okay there? Okay, repeat it for all of us.
I think, we listened for this information. I think
a hell of a lot of information.
Just repeat it. I've more or less got it, but I just want you to repeat it. I think will help me as well.
Okay, Arth, do you want to teach us, or do you want to repeat it?
No, you can teach me. I'm happy.
Okay.
Damn, it's on you. Listen, we can't teach. That's how we're learning. People teach, we learn.
All right. Well, even I need the notes sometimes. Believe me, sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't.
You are
all right.
compared to us, so don't panic.
All right. So look, Rav Yehuda holds that the owner is liable for unintentional damage. So what's his reason? Because he says, listen, he's working on the laws for kofir liability. Because just as in regard to kofir, he holds the owner liable even if the ox kills unintentionally.
Okay.
So too, in regard to unintentional damages caused by the ox is liable. Okay, so he's quite stringent, Rabbi Yehuda.
Yeah.
Rabbi Shimon says, look, he derives the ox's, the owner's non-liability from the laws governing the ox's execution. So just as regards its execution, it's exempt from killing unintentional, so too regarding unintentional damage, its owner is exempt. So who's more stringent, Rabbi Yehuda or Rav Shimon?
Rabbi Yehuda.
Yes, why?
Because so what Rabbi Yehuda is doing is that he's taking it. Firstly, he's assuming that the kofir is paid when it's unintentional. Not all of them agree with that. So that's his opinion. So we'll base it on his opinion. So he's basing it that the kofir payment, because in the event of unintentional death of an ox, you're going to pay kofir. Then so much more so if it's damage, even more so if it's damage. You pay if there's damage, even if it's unintentional. So he says you do pay. So now the other rabbi, what's his name? Rabbi
Shimon.
Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon said no, it's not the case. You don't pay. So he's basically saying that you don't pay. I think he's saying you don't pay kofir. I don't quite know if he says that for unintentional.
He's saying that. He's saying you don't pay kofir if it's an unintentional.
Correct. So therefore you don't. Why don't you pay kofir? Because most of them say that you don't pay kofir for unintentional. You pay damages.
But why? No, but why?
Because he doesn't need a kapora. He's because it's unintentional. He's not up for murder, the owner. So because he's not up for murder.
I'm looking for a particular statement. Okay, and that statement is as follows. I'm looking for the fact that they parallel the ox's execution with kofir payment.
Oh yeah, so, I left that out.
What it's saying is as follows. If you wouldn't execute a person because they killed unintentionally, you don't execute the ox. If there's no execution of the ox, there's no kofir payment. That's the parallel. Okay? Now, Rabbi Yehuda is actually quite logical. He's saying, listen, your ox was muad. You had a responsibility for looking after that ox, for not letting it kill. The fact of it is that if your ox killed because you were negligent, you still have to pay kofir, irrespective of whether you put the animal to death or not. Now, we don't know if you put the animal to death or not, but I'm assuming you don't because he's not holding it according to Rabbi Shimon. Otherwise, they wouldn't have an argument. In other words, he's probably saying you don't put the animal to death. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a discussion. Does that make sense? You wouldn't put the animal to death if it's unintentional because the animal didn't do anything wrong. It was unintentional. Okay, but still, a person died.
Yeah, I've got this when you finished.
Okay, still a person died. And more than that, Rabbi Yehuda makes sense because picture this, guys. Your ox damaged a property. There's no discernment generally for damages unintentionally or damages on purpose. If it damaged property, you'd have to pay it. Say somebody reversed in your car and they didn't plan it 6 months in advance, but they reversed and hit your car in a car accident. What do you care if they never premeditated? They damaged your car. What do you care? The only reason there's a question here is because there's no direct pasuk dealing with somebody's injury by an ox as such. There's a pasuk that deals with death of a man or a woman, right? Or of a boy or a girl. And there's a separate pasuk if your ox, your property injures somebody else's property. But there's no direct pasuk if your property injures somebody else, another person, as such. It's not a direct pasuk. It's a pasuk saying that if a person damages a person, he's liable for nezek shalom and for additional damages. But there's no pasuk with regards to directly if your ox damages a person. That's why there's a whole discussion. Otherwise, there's nothing to discuss if there's a pasuk.
Okay.
So again, Rabbi Yehuda saying...
Let me see if I have this. Rabbi Yehuda says whether or not it's by accident or intentionally, unintentionally, you got to pay kofir, and the animal, whether it's put to death or not put to death. Okay, and Rabbi Shimon says different way. He says if it's unintentional, you don't have to pay kofir because your animal's being put to death.
No, because your animal is not being put to death.
Your animal's not being put to death. Sorry,
If it's unintentional.
it's unintentional. Okay.
Okay, so exactly as Arthur said, if it's an unintentional killing, we don't execute the animal, because just as we wouldn't execute a person for an unintentional murder. Again, the person tried to murder an animal, but the animal got out of the way. He took a shot at it, and an animal quickly at the last second jumped out the way, and the shot killed a person. A person isn't put to death, he goes to the city of refuge. So therefore, just as we wouldn't put the Jew to death, we wouldn't put the animal to death for an unintentional killing. If there's no execution, there's no kofir. That's according to Rabbi Shimon. So if there's no kofir, just as an unintentional killing doesn't result in the killing of an unintentional killing of a person, doesn't result in the execution of the animal. If there's no execution of the animal, there's no kofir payment. There's a link. So too, with regards to unintentional damage, its owner is exempt. Does that make sense? That's according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, yes, okay, for unintentional murder, the animal isn't put to death. I'm sure he's saying that the animal still isn't put to death, because that's the chiddush. If the animal was put to death for an unintentional killing, you would obviously pay kofir. But what I'm sure the chiddush is here is that the animal is not put to death, but you still pay kofir. Why? Because it's a muad ox, and since it's a muad ox, you had every right to look after your animal because it was a habitual gora. And therefore, why shouldn't you pay kofir? And therefore, since you're paying kofir, if an animal killed unintentionally, so too, if your animal injured unintentionally, you should pay the damages. That's what Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning is, because he derives the pasul damages from injury with regards to damages of death being kofir. But he says we do not derive the laws for payments from the laws of execution. The two have nothing to do with each other. So the Gemara says, okay, that makes sense, Rabbi Yehuda. What about Rabbi Shimon? Why doesn't he derive the law of kofir liability, similarly liable for unintentional damage caused by his ox? Does that make sense? Because it's saying, the Gemara asks, and Rabbi Yehuda as well, let him derive from the laws of the ox's execution. And Rav Yehuda maintains that we derive laws regarding payments, in brackets damages, from laws regarding payments, in brackets kofir. The one is death, the one is injury. But we do not derive laws from payments regarding execution. Two have nothing to do with each other. So the Gemara then goes back to Rabbi Shimon and says, it makes sense. Let him derive the law for the owner's kofir liability, similarly liable for unintentional damage caused by his ox. So it's saying, listen, what's it got to do with kofir? So the Gemara explains, Rabbi Shimon contends that we derive liability of the ox's damages from liability of the ox's death, to the exclusion of deriving liability of the ox from kofir, which is the owner's liability. Okay? So in a nutshell, in the case of damages, it's the ox's action that caused the owner liability. Okay, not the owner's negligence in not watching his ox. Although it's true that the owner guarded his ox would not be liable to pay for damage, it's only because the Torah exempted him in that case, the obligation per se. However, it's not because he neglected to guard his animal. Okay, so the obligation for damages is therefore similar to the death sentence of the ox for killing, which is also the result of the ox's action. So in other words, the kofir obligation, on the other hand, which serves as an atonement for the owner, is a result of the owner's misdeed, and he caused the death of the person by failing to look after his muad ox properly. Okay, so that's what Rashi said. It cannot be said that kofir is the result of the ox's action. For why should the owner need atonement for an act performed by his ox? Does that make sense, guys? Or do you want me to explain it more simply?
I've got it.
So explain it to the guys.
Well, I just heard the end part. So you're not responsible. You shouldn't require atonement for something that your animal did. So it has to be something that you did. And what you did wrong is you neglected to look after it properly. That's what you did wrong. But you never actually did the actual killing. But your animal did. So because of that, you have to pay for it.
Correct. Correct. Arthur, Kevin, does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So listen, we're on 44B2. We'll do tomorrow a quick summary for a minute or two of this particular issue. And it will only take a minute or two. And I think we're done for today, guys.